All right. Hey, everyone. I'm back again, this time to talk about generative art, which is a big personal passion of mine. And to me, generative art represents one of the best use cases of the potential of NFTs, which you may have heard us talk about on the last panel. I wrote this article in August of 2021 after just spending the year being completely degenerate about collecting every piece of art blocks I could. And you know, in this article, I told my journey of how I went from never having collected art to spending almost all of my liquid net worth on buying these JPEGs and not being even able to tell my family what I was doing. And you know, this piece in particular, which you can't really see that well, unfortunately, is a Fidenza by Tyler Hobbs. It's one of 5 or 6 dark lifestyles, which makes it the rarest breed of Fidenza. I bought this piece for something like 22 ETH at the time, which was like 3 or 4 times the next highest sale of Fidenzas at the time. And you know, in the Art Blocks Discord, when I bought this thing, everyone was like, "Oh my God, this guy's nuts! What is he doing?" And this piece I would later go on to sell for 125 ETH, which at the time was an all-time high in Art Blocks. And so you would think I would be very happy about that. But then within 1 month of having done that sale, another black Fidenza sold for 1,000 ETH in a completely nutty run-up. And so to me, this piece is quite meaningful, mainly because I don't have it, but because of what it represented, like the darkness of the collecting journey. And so you heard me talk on the NFT panel about this question, is retail even ready to be in this game where, you know, the most stressful parts of the Art Blocks journey were actually when the thing kept going up, right? Because think about how stressful it must be to hold on to this stuff when it's really life-changing money and you get offered 100 ETH for something and you have to make a decision, am I going to take it or not? You know, it kind of squares with my own journey on like, I first bought Ethereum at 97 cents. I bought a massive amount of this stuff, like 10,000 ETH. And I put it on a paper wallet and I put it in my closet. And I said, I'm never going to sell this thing. And then in 2 weeks, the price of ETH triples. And I'm like, oh my God, that's like so much money. And then I take the paper wallet out and I sell it at $2.25. And then the next I hear about it, because I got busy with work, was from my analyst at Goldman, who was like, hey, have you ever heard of this thing called Ethereum? It's like $20 now. Should I buy it? And at the time, I was like, that makes no sense. How can ETH be $20? You should, of course, not buy it. But that just shows you, you know, how these mental anchors we put in our minds about value are really so tricky, particularly for this entire asset class. So I collected my first NFT in 2017, but I was not a big NFT collector. I remember going to NFT NYC in like, I think it was 2018. All everyone could do is talk about CryptoPunks. And I saw these like pixelated, you know, characters, and I was like, you couldn't pay me to own one of those things. Like, I don't know what these people are talking about. It was that and virtual land, which is a whole other topic. But it was only in 2021, as I was doing research about this question of what makes NFTs special. Like, what is on-chain art, right? Because at the time, there was starting to be a lot of conversations about, oh, you know, NFTs aren't real because, like, I could take a picture of this room and put it on OpenSea, and now it's an NFT, ha, ha, ha. And of course, that media, together with the digital signature, the media is on some centralized server somewhere. So why does that have any value? And that's why I started looking at Art Blocks, because Art Blocks, they made a point about all this digital native art, this idea of algorithms as art. For the first time, it could be owned using NFTs as a primitive. And because it was digitally native and it was fully on-chain, aside from basic dependence on things like P5.js and some basic JavaScript libraries, it's completely on-chain. So that was very attractive to me. And that's how I first got in the space. So what is generative art? The best definition of generative art to me comes from Philip Gallanter, who defines it as a system, such as a set of natural language rules, a computer program, a machine, or other procedural invention which is set into motion with some degree of autonomy contributing to or resulting in a completed work of art. Now, the notable thing about this definition is it covers an artistic practice that has existed for over 60 years. Some of the earliest computer generated art pioneers, Vera Molnar, and you see this one is from 1968 here, you know, and even stuff like Sol LeWitt's stuff, right? It really questioned what is art. So I think the best way to understand what makes generative art special is this primitive of controlled randomness, right? Because you have an artist that, at least in the case of long-form generative art, codes an algorithm, and every time you spin the wheel, so to speak, right? What you're actually doing is when you mint the piece, you introduce a random seed into the algorithm, and that can produce a potentially infinite set of outputs from that algorithm. But the only real pieces of art from that algorithm are going to be the, for example, 500 editions that the artist officially mints on chain. So that idea of controlled randomness, I think, is such a good description of what makes this asset class special. If we could roll the video, you can see Jared Tarbell here.
Here's something I called Substrate, and according to Google, this is my most popular algorithm. Let's imagine a system where we draw straight lines. We're starting with just 3 of them. There's 2 rules. A line will continue until it hits the edge of the screen or another line, at which point it stops and 2 new lines are created. So very simple rules, but if we let this run, let's just see what happens. Created even from just simple rules.
All right, we can cut the video.
There's some coloring effect that's going on.
So I think that video demonstrates really visually what makes this medium special, right? And I think the notable thing about Substrate as an algorithm is it was created, I think, in 2010 or 2011. This is all pre-NFTs, right? So if you wanted to own Substrate, the algorithm, how would you do that? Well, the best you could do is go to Jared Tarbell's website. Jared Tarbell, he did this as a hobby. He's the co-founder of Etsy. And he would do creative coding as a hobby together with a bunch of other hobbyists. And how did they make a living out of it? Well, they couldn't. The best they could do was sell prints. And maybe they could sell you their algorithm by including a copy of it, perhaps, on a disk. But did you really own it, right? And so this idea of creating a marketplace around digital native art like that is really what NFTs and platforms like Art Blocks have enabled in terms of bringing art and market together. Now, it's possible that you can go too far in that direction, right? I think one of the most interesting anecdotes I have is when I went to go see the director of the Whitney, and I was enthusiastically telling him about generative art and why this was, you know, such a big thing. And after my kind of 10-minute description of why it was so special, he said just one line, which was, "That's market, that's not art." And I think this is one of the tensions that if you really care about art, one of the things that distinguishes true collectors from kind of speculators is that you buy this stuff to hold. In fact, I was just at Frieze in Seoul, the Frieze Art Festival. It was their first time having it, and some of the best pieces exhibited there, you would go and ask them, hey, can I, like, how much does this cost? Can I buy it? And they'd be like, you can't buy it here. You have to, like, be on a list, register your interest, basically tell everyone you're not going to sell this thing, right? And that kind of establishing your bona fides as a collector is very important in the real art world. So how that meshes with the NFT space is going to be an interesting topic. But I think Tyler Hobbs, who is the creator of the Fidenza algorithm, which you can see in the top right there, you can instantly get a sense of visually, oh, this is a very interesting algorithm, right? Because there's things that look relatively more common here, and then things that stand out as being more special. And I think, going back to the NFT panel, I said things like music NFTs, what I struggle with is there's no liquidity of snap judgment. Whereas I can look at something like a Fidenza set and say, oh, that's a common, that's like really exceptional because that's a micro or that's black or whatever. And I think it's in these kind of speculative collection games that a lot of these collecting communities come. But I think Tyler Hobbs, who I'd really encourage everyone to read in his blog, he's written some great posts about why generative art matters. And it goes to how the digital tools that programmers are using these days are essentially the creative medium for artists, just like wood, concrete, glass, and steel, to keep up with the latest of artistic expression, right? And so there's a lot of talk about generative AI these days. And one question I get a lot is, well, why does this stuff have any value if, Stable Diffusion is just going to produce 50,000 of those things, right? And it's a really interesting question, right? Because it goes to the notion of what is the intrinsic value of any of this stuff, right? It ultimately goes down to societal consensus. And I think a good example of this is the fact that Dmitry Chernyak, who made the set Ringers here, there's 1,000 ringers, and the creative concept is how many ways can you wrap string around a peg? This happens to be Ringers 911, and what's notable about it is the fact that purely probabilistically, there's 72 reds out of the 1,000 ringers. This one happens to look like an ambulance. So this ringer is known by the community as the ambulance. And if you rerun this algo 1,000 times, you're going to get an entirely different set of outputs that will never recur. And so he, as part of the testing of this algorithm, there were 1,000 different ringers that were basically the testnet ringers. And it's just really interesting to compare the real ones versus the testnet ones to see, oh, what could have been in the algorithm but didn't come out. So this idea of long-form generative art where the artist has no control over the ultimate output of the algorithm, but it's purely probabilistic as a result of the output space, I think is just absolutely fascinating because it combines the best of like Robin Hood-style speculation on which artists are going to go up or down. It's gaming-style gotcha in terms of your desire to pull a legendary or a rare. It's community myth-telling, and it's the ability to tap into all the composability, right? Like against my art blocks collection, like I could take a loan of $100,000 and get that bid in, or get that offer in 5 seconds, because there's bots on NFTFi that are lending as a fraction of the floor price. There's no way I could do that if I were holding a Picasso, right? So it's just it's very interesting. And FX Hash is another really interesting platform on Tezos. I'm a big collector on Tezos, and the reason I started gravitating towards FX Hash is, frankly, art blocks got too expensive. And if you're one of these serious collectors who doesn't like to sell, money doesn't grow on trees. So eventually, you have this desire to go to the margins, go find the fringes of the creative art scene, and that's how I found Zancan, who's this French generative artist. He was only coding on Tezos, and his pieces now have sold for over $100,000 on Tezos. which kind of goes to my point earlier that the chain, I think, ultimately matters less than the societal consensus of value wherever that chain is. FX hash is an interesting experiment in community building because Art Blocks is a curated community. So if you're a creative coder, you have to go get accepted by the curation board to go list on Art Blocks. FX hash, on the other hand, I actually released an algorithm after a day of coding with my 12-year-old, no one needed to approve that. Everyone could just go mint against that thing. And so it was a free-for-all. And something like that shouldn't work, right? Because you would assume just the trash outweighs, the signals outweighed by the noise. But that didn't happen. And I think why that didn't happen is one of the most interesting things to look for as you look at the evolution of Web3 communities, because the community became the curation layer. The creation layer, the curation layer, and the commerce engine behind value created by the collective. And I think that's ultimately one of the most interesting things about Web3. So in Art Blocks, we've gone through this crazy, almost looks like a Ponzi cycle of just massive volumes and a quote crash to a more sustainable, call it 20 to 40 million GMV per month. At the peak, Art Blocks was doing monthly GMV of $750 million, which is 20% of the global art market turnover. Now, that's obviously unsustainable, but I think the interesting question is, over the long run, what percentage of global art market turnover can digital art have? And the enlightening thing to me was in having conversations with the leading gallerists in Seoul and elsewhere, everyone recognizes that things like generative art have a long pedigree and history, and they're accepted by the group as being interesting. So what's wrong with this space? What's wrong with this space is it's really hard to deal with, right? Like, I don't know if this is true or not, but there's one kind of big CEO of a large kind of wallet company who I was having dinner with the other day, and he said, you can hack a ledger in 5 minutes. So I don't want to spread FUD, don't quote me on that. But like, imagine that's true. And you have all of your assets on this thing, and it can just be hacked, or if you lose the key, right? So people like the convenience of having to delegate trust to someone else. And so when you have like these creative communities and the ordinary consumer, they don't want to have to deal with maximal decentralization. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges in this space. And that's why one thing I hope to see in this space is to take the ownership and collection games around art and turn that into a community that can in turn generate its own GDP through not just collection as a vehicle, but using that core shared ritual to then what I say is congregate the cultural elite and drive the digital vanguard in terms of creating our own culture around not just generative art, but this extends to digital fashion, music, film, all of these social ownership and creation layers that I think Web3 is ultimately about. So that's it. Happy to take any questions. Sorry.
Okay, there's no microphone, but do you think that Hi, Jari Paino from Supremacy Games. Do you think that the AI tools like Midjourney and DALL-E are going to affect the generative art scene?
I view these things as tools that are going to be used by artists, but ultimately, if you're really used to looking at this space, a lot of the outputs, you don't get the beauty of that controlled randomness, right? It's a very fine distinction because, take something like Fidenzas. If they're just totally random outputs, there's no coherence to the set, right? The beautiful thing about generative art to me is you have just enough unpredictable variation that the mind can understand and say, okay, that's rare, this is common, but it's all part of the same set, right? And I haven't seen that yet with some of the generative AI tools. I think even if it gets there technically, you have a social consensus problem around some of these tools. You need a community to tell stories around why this or that artist is valuable, just like the real art world. And that part's missing for stuff just at the tools layer.
Yeah, so two-part question. How would you recommend getting started with collecting and also with potentially generating in case I was an artist?
So there's a lot of resources on the Art Blocks Discord and several other places about kind of creative coding. There's books written on this stuff. Casey Rias has written a book on kind of creative coding at the more beginner level, and then there's more advanced treatments. There's histories of generative art. On the collection side, my number one advice is I always tell people actually start collecting on Tezos, not because I think that's like a better investment than ETH, but the price point is such that you can develop your own taste, and that's the most important thing. Whereas if your first buy is 100 ETH, well, 50 ETH now, Bored Ape, because some influencer told you, hey, this thing's gonna moon, like you're never gonna have the chance to develop your own taste. Whereas if you're spending 10 bucks for something because you think it looks cool, but then later discover it's either copy minted or everything looks like this, whatever, you write it off as part of the learning journey. That's the most important part. Alex.
Do you, when you think about generative art, do you think of it in terms of sort of cubism versus impressionism, or more in terms of watercolor versus printmaking? Is it a sort of medium or an epoch, a period?
That's a really good question. I think it's both. I think it's a bit of both because we addressed a bit just the pure tool side, which is rapidly evolving. But I think the more important part is the cubism versus impressionism part, right? The kind of commentary of, is this thing even art that art historians, art curators will respect and value as art? And that's something that a lot of NFT collectors don't like to hear, by the way, because they're like, screw the institutions, we don't need them. Like, we're our own cultural gatekeepers, right? That's been the whole kind of PFP mantra. But this stuff's different. Like, to me, the best commentator, curator in the space is Jason Bailey. And he has this article, for those who want to dig in more, called Why Love Generative Art? And if you look at how he writes that article, it's very much about placing all of what's happening and the innovation that's happening within the context of what's come before. And I think that's really important. Last question in the back. In the very back.
Looking at Bored Ape Yacht Club at the moment and all that NFT projects, the SEC now starts in terms of regulations to label them or red flag them as actually security tokens due to airdrops, tokens, roadmaps, projects. For art NFTs, most of the time you don't have projects or roadmaps, utilities, airdrops and all that stuff. So actually generative art NFTs or art NFTs in general are very lean utility tokens in terms of regulation. So how much more are you now bullish on generative art NFTs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole framework, this is just my personal opinion. I was in London yesterday at a Goldman conference talking to Giancarlo about this. And my view is the whole utility token framework is actually really screwed up, because what it's resulted in is people creating governance tokens and all these other things that by construction have no economic value because people don't want them to be securities. But if instead of focusing on the instrument, and whether that's a collectible like generative art, a utility token, or a security token, we instead focused on, was the thing sold in reliance on the common efforts of some group? I think that's the more important part. And the beautiful thing about generative art is it's sold as is, right? So one of my favorite projects recently was the Art Gobblers project that Paradigm launched, because it's shipped complete. And I was whitelisted because I was quite involved in that one. But I couldn't mint because I actually I had to format my computer, long story. So I couldn't mint. And I was like, hey guys, can you change my address? And they're like, no, because this thing is feature complete. It's done. And there's a certain beauty to that, right? So I think what's more important to answering that question is just what are the expectations in terms of continued involvement from that group? And the more they have to build something, the bigger the risk they're selling you snake oil, as opposed to something that you buy and appreciate today. So yeah. Okay, I think we're good. Thanks, everyone.